Herodotus observed of the ancient Egyptians, "They are religious excessively, beyond all other men." There is little doubt that religion inspired the majority of art and architecture left to us by the Egyptians. The amount of resources spent on religious activity proves that it dominated the thoughts of the people. It influenced everything they did. Of course, that includes their magic. Hey folks, I'm back. My cancer treatment is coming to an end and I am ready to make some more videos. If you've watched before, you probably already noticed a lot of changes. I have a ton of announcements, but I'm going to save those for the end. I must, however, take this time to thank everyone for their kind words of encouragement as I fought my battles. They truly did help. I'm not fully recovered yet, so please be forgiving as I unwisely tackle a huge topic for my first time back. Of course, this will not be anything close to a comprehensive overview of ancient Egyptian religion. What I'm tackling here are concepts I believe practitioners will find useful and clear up misconceptions. And I recognize that religion is a loaded word for a lot of people. I wish I could bring everyone to an understanding that religious experiences encompass a wide variety of traditions. And it's unfortunate that here in the West, our concept of religion is skewed by the overwhelming influence of the religions of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. For many of us, their organization and theology was the poison pill that turned us away from all religion. But we should not allow that to color our view because many are radically different than those traditions. For example, the idea that a flock would attend a temple on a regular basis, hear a sermon, and be told how to believe would be totally foreign to the ancient Egyptians. That's not what the temples were for. They were a place for priests to serve the god. They had economic functions as well, distributing food and goods and at times providing for the less fortunate. But the majority of their resources came directly from the king. The people learned about the religion by the stories they told each other and the festivals the temples would lead. I also understand that modern magic has a general distaste for religion and belief in general. Chaos magic teaches that all beliefs are just tools to be used and discarded at will. I know that many people want to insulate themselves from belief, as they think it produces intolerance. My experience is it doesn't have to be like that, that we could be more like the ancient Egyptians and accept multiple truths at the same time, without compromising our own beliefs. In fact, I would argue that the best magical practitioners in the world, those coming from African diasporic traditions, are so good at magic because they never doubt the existence of the spirits and their traditions. That unshakable belief is a net benefit to the work of magic and doesn't preclude respecting the ways other people do it. Do not doubt for a second that the ancient Egyptians absolutely believed the gods were real. And if you want to practice based on their example, you're going to have to believe without reservation. One of the biggest conflicts in Egyptology is not on whether or not the Egyptians believed, but how they practiced their faith. On this channel, we avoid fringe archaeology like the plague, and rely heavily on the scholarship for our sources. Let's understand what I am supporting here is not fringe, as it's accepted by a minority of bona fide scholars, and the position is becoming more mainstream. The ancient Egyptians left surprisingly little on how their religion manifested in their thoughts, and not much on the purpose of rites, and there remains large gaps in the record on the rites themselves. This has led many Egyptologists to believe that the Egyptians did not engage in mysticism, that producing altered states of consciousness to experience their connection with the spirits was of little concern to them, and everything was done with a pragmatic purpose. Thankfully, not all Egyptologists see it that way. They cite, with good reason, that every contemporary people surrounding the Egyptians had pervasive mystical practices, and to believe that the Egyptians didn't engage in these type of activities, which seem bound to human nature, is pure silliness. Accepting the practices of the ancient Egyptians as mystic has other biases to overcome as well, as Western scholars have until very recently treated the study of magic and mysticism as too offensive to Christians. Of course, ignoring these subjects, which were obviously pervasive in ancient Egyptian life, is doing the discipline a great disservice. Due to this fear of exploring our own occult traditions, many have turned to Eastern mysticism as the template for all mystic activity, and the implication that mystic activity typically includes forms of meditation that have the goal of the removal of self and considers the passion of personal belief to be detrimental. As modern magi, I hope we have learned by now that meditation, or if you want, simply call it producing altered states of consciousness, takes on almost infinite forms, many of which are ecstatic and not reserved, as can be seen in the ancient Egyptian festivals. In fact, simply performing a ritual out loud every single day, as was done by the temple priests, can be a mystic experience. Is single-mindedly focusing on a text not itself a meditation? And this is why I've always espoused daily ritual practice, even if something simplistic that takes a couple of minutes per day, as it becomes a time when you turn your thoughts to the numinous and ground yourself in your belief. There are plenty of good reasons why the record on Egyptian mystical practices would be sparse, starting with that these elements may have been assumed on the part of the Egyptians, and since writing was rare and costly, why include what everyone knows? Part of the reason may be is that the Egyptians considered these things to be secrets, not to be shared. Keep in mind, we know that the Greek Eleusinian rites existed, but still have little idea of what they consisted of. Perhaps the mystic teachings were kept restricted in the House of Life, the temple schools. In fact, there are some later texts, such as the translation by Richard Drasnow and Carl Theodor Zazich in their book Conversations in the House of Life, a book I have recommended several times, which is, to anyone with eyes open, an initiatory text. The point is well made in the book Shamanic Wisdom in the Pyramid Text, The Mystical Tradition of Ancient Egypt by Jeremy Nadler. Nadler makes a good argument that the various writings that Egyptologists have lumped together as funerary texts, like the Pyramid Text, the Coffin Text, and the Book of Gates and others, were more than a guidebook for the dead, that these spells and rites were also meant for the living to undergo a mystical experience, exploring the land of the dead and celestial realms. To quote Nadler, if the so-called funerary texts of ancient Egypt, of which the pyramid texts are the earliest example, were not simply for the use of the dead, but also for the living, this implies the existence in ancient Egypt of a certain type of mysticism in which the living had experiences, probably in a highly charged ritual context, that would normally occur only after one had died. This idea has always made sense to me. To make lists of spells, keeping in mind that the Egyptian word for spells means useful things, and that these useful things would never be used by the living, seems contradictory to the effort made to produce them. It also explains their origins. It is very difficult for me to believe that the Egyptians would simply make up religious texts with no basis in actual experience. How to use these texts as a guide for mystic experiences becomes the question, at least the one we should ask as Magi. Unfortunately, that's beyond the scope of this video, but I am working on producing rituals based on these texts for use by a modern magus, and you can be sure that will be a subject covered in the future. Nadler's hypothesis is that what we call the funerary texts were describing ritual practices akin to shamanic journeying, that these rituals may have been how the ancient Egyptians gained extensive knowledge on the nature of the underworld. What else can we extrapolate from what we know about later texts heavily influenced by the Egyptians, and what we know about how magic is used from the perspective of being practicing magi ourselves? What I'm about to put forth here are my own theories, which I believe are well justified by the historical and archaeological record, and also something near and dear to my own practice. I have mentioned before my admiration for Dr. Rita Lucarelli, who has produced excellent research on the topic of Egyptian demons. And remember, the definition of demon on this channel is not a comment on whether or not the spirit is malefic or beneficial. We define demon simply as any spirit that primarily exists in the underworld. Dr. Lucarelli has observed that while the Egyptians believed in a host of underworld spirits, they lacked a coherent demonology. This is true, as no one has ever found a text showing hierarchies and powers as we see in later demonological systems. But the question remains, did the Egyptians communicate with these spirits? The crux of the question is, where did the Egyptians get all this information on the nature of these demons? Once again, it's difficult for me as a practitioner to believe that they just made it up, that this knowledge of the spirits, like all other cultures that have a strong magical tradition, came from some kind of received information which was produced by a mystical experience. There must have been, for at least some of them, a ritual entailing altered states of consciousness, probably used by priests, from which they received knowledge of the nature of these spirits, which implies some form of communication, at the very least visions, if not a dialogue with the entities themselves. Evidence for this kind of activity can be found in later texts, those that came shortly after the dissolution of Egypt, but were heavily influenced by Egyptian ideas, with some of them even being written in Coptic Egyptian. I am of course talking here about the Greek magical papyri, which has a plethora of spells that use Egyptian gods and mythology, and includes spells for contacting demons. And, as Jake Stratton Kent discovered, the Greek magical papyri influenced all later grimoires and demonologies. The PGM itself openly declares much of its contents is a continuation of Egyptian magical practices, and I don't think it's a stretch to theorize that it may constitute a transcription of an earlier Egyptian oral tradition, because once again, despite what seems like a large body of Egyptian texts that have been recovered, we know that writing itself and literacy were extremely rare, and for the sake of secrecy and a broader dissemination of knowledge, there must have been an oral tradition in Egypt that we have no record of. Of course, proof of this is not forthcoming. My limited scholarship precludes me from the rigor it would take to make a salient argument, and all I can say is that it makes sense, and in fact seems likely, given the perspective of a practitioner and knowledge of the Western esoteric tradition. Given my own experience, I would bet that the Egyptians were communicating with these spirits, either through journeying, through the Dawat, the land of the dead, using some version of the spells found in the funerary text, or perhaps other methodologies. One other thing worth mentioning, though the evidence for this is even more sparse, is that there are some who believe that the concept of jinn, the spirits of Arabic mythology, have their roots in ancient Egypt. They cite similarities between sub-Saharan traditions involving similar spirits and posit this knowledge spread through Egypt and later become the demonology of the jinn in later Arabic cultures. I'm not so sure about this one, at least on any kind of one-to-one comparison. I don't think that the Egyptians were working with hierarchies of jinn, but it is possible, just like the ancient Canaanite spirits ended up being a part of the later medieval grimoires, that stories of Egyptian spirits associated with the natural phenomena did influence the later traditions of the jinn. Gordon White once used an excellent analogy to explain this kind of thinking. He was referring to the grimoire tradition and how at times it can be infuriatingly incomplete. He likened the work of the Magi in these situations, where the knowledge is not going to be found in the record, is akin to the movie Jurassic Park, where the scientists had incomplete gene sequences for the dinosaurs and used frog DNA to fill in the gaps. Here, we are using later magical texts, obviously influenced by ancient Egypt, to fill in the gaps on methodology and give us ways to interact with the Egyptian spirits. Now you may be asking yourself, what does this have to do with religion? What you must understand and accept fully is that ancient Egyptians believed What you must understand and accept fully is that ancient Egyptians believed that magical practice and religious practice are the same thing. There was no distinction. Much of the evidence for this is found in the spells themselves, which, more often than not, cite mythological stories in their incantation. Well, I think that's a lot to chew on, and I hope it gives people something to think about when it comes to a magical practice based on ancient Egyptian tradition, and also how all traditions are formed, and how you can use this knowledge to build your own. Time for all those announcements I warned you about. On the health front, I have spent 3 weeks in the hospital undergoing a bone marrow transplant. And like I said, I'm not yet back to my full self. More recovery ahead, but no more treatments. This should stop my cancer from coming back for good. I need to apologize to my Ko-Fi members. Though your numbers are few, I appreciate you. Unfortunately, treatment has made it too difficult at times to do monthly tarot readings, and for that I beg your forgiveness. Those will be returning for $10 plus Ko-Fi members later this year. Despite not having any rewards currently, I am still asking people to donate through my Ko-Fi to help with the costs associated with treatment. To use my favorite line from Shakespeare, pay my poverty and not my will. Now this next announcement may seem a little weird, as I have taken on a new project in the past few months, despite my struggles with cancer. But one must strike when there is opportunity, and my good friend Zentrell and myself were given the chance to buy a screen printing business, and we felt it was a great fit for us. I want to invite all of you to visit silkyscreens.net and check out our many designs. Since taking over the company, we have started printing shirts with occult themes, like our Babylon Barbie shirt and our Jack Parsons shirt. And one we are particularly proud of, Dimbala Veve, created by Haitian artist Hanel. In the coming months, I'll be closing down the Redbubble store, and all Scroll of Thoth merchandise will be sold through Silky Screens, which means a much higher quality product. As always, thank you for watching, and a special thank you to those who have stuck with the channel through my trials. I'm forever grateful to have a place to share my research and ideas. Thank you again for watching. We'll see you next time. Oh yeah, okay, so what happened to Thresciornis? So, magical tradition, people have magical names, and I feel that these should change. If your practice and your life and you had such a momentous experience, it's time to change things up, to take on a new name. And for me, that really happened when I went to Egypt. I didn't change it right away, but that really was the catalyst. I think my practice just took on a whole new level after going to Egypt. And then, of course, my second round of cancer and going through all that, like a trip to the underworld itself. So yeah, my new magical name is now Merrick, which is a hell of a lot easier to say and to spell. It's an ancient Egyptian name, which means he who loves wisdom. So yeah, there you have it. Like and subscribe. Forgot to say that too. Thanks for watching.